Hello, friends. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Svet Stoyanov, and this is the Percussion Collective. Some of the members are here. Myself, I have been one of the members who was a founding member of the group, and most recently I was fortunate to be able to be a part of the Percussion Collective's recording of Seaborn, which will come out very soon. I really hope that you would enjoy listening to this. And also, before I move on to the next person to introduce, Happy Easter to everyone today who celebrates that. Thank you for being with us.
All right.
Okay, I'll go.
Okay.
Oh, Jonny, you go.
I'll go next. My name is Jonny Allen. I'm another member of the Percussion Collective, feeling very lucky today to get to spend some time virtually with our friends here and with Alejandro. In the collective, I guess more recently got to perform the Chris Theophanides Concerto drum circles with the Aspen Festival Orchestra. Actually got to do that with Matt over there, so that was really fun. Maybe we'll swing it over to Mari now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mari Yoshinaga. Thanks for tuning in. I'm in Seattle right now. Recently, I played chime part, like Matt plays, in drum circles as well. And I've been playing piano and vibraphone 1 for sextet shows. I've been having a great time with these guys. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Keown. And some of the recent projects that I've done with the collective was first, kind of one of the reasons we're here today is I did the unofficial premiere of the first movement from Alejandro Viñao's Stress and Flow. We did that at our big PASIC showcase about a year and a half ago. And besides that, I have done some of the concerto performances of Chris Theophanides' work for us and premiered that with Oregon Symphony last year.
Thank you so much, guys. We have a really special person with us today, and we were actually about to have concluded a tour. Basically, we would have played a piece on this tour of Alejandro's called Stress and Flow. It's a commission that was a worldwide consortium. Many people joined for this. And what we wanted to do, since times are challenging this day, is basically try to contribute and share with you our love and as much as we could without being in the room with you about this piece and tell you about it, and to have the one and only Alejandro with us as well. I want to just say this man has done so much, in my opinion. He has invested a lot, basically, of his humanity, of his intellect, of his talents, of writing, and he has helped, I think, percussion grow in just tremendous ways. I personally feel that because of his compositions, we have grown as an art form, technically, musically, artistically. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Alejandro Viñao. Thank you so much for joining us and for being with us. And let's begin with a few questions for Alejandro. Thank you for being with us, Alejandro.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Sorry about my brief disappearance, but my mobile phone was ringing frenetically in the back. I wanted to get rid of it.
So I thought that was your new piece. So I have the first question for you, Alejandro. So I want to ask you how you started writing for music for computer, and how you found your musical voice in electroacoustic music writing. As you put it the other day on other videos, you use the word magic. When you use computer music, it creates this magic of having somebody else on stage, and the collaboration of acoustic music and electronic music is very magical. And I don't think it's very usual to run into starting writing music for electronic music. So I want to ask you how you started writing for that, and also the progression from tumblers to the new piece of Stress and Flow. I just realized it's been 30 years between those pieces, and I want to hear what you did differently, and how you found your voice in electroacoustic music.
Okay, that's a good question. I started working with electronics relatively late by today's standards. I was trained as a purely acoustic composer by a Russian composer in Argentina, Jacobo Fija. And I came to London in 1970, well, started in 76 at the Royal College of Music as a postgraduate student. And I found there was a electroacoustic studio there, and it was the first time I got into an electroacoustic studio. Not because there weren't electroacoustic studios in Buenos Aires, I simply wasn't coming from that background, and my teacher was very old school Russian, so he would have none of those sounds that for him were nothing more than the sound of a jet engine taking off or landing, as he put it. So when I discovered electroacoustic music at the Royal College of Music in London, I got very interested, but I was coming from an entirely acoustic tradition, having written quartets and choir music, orchestral music, what have you. And of course, in those days, electroacoustic studios were really tape studios, because this is before the personal computer. The computers existed, but they were huge, occupied a whole building practically. So I got into this analog studio, and then I also started working with computers at another university. And in those days, it was a very cumbersome process. Also, if you were working with computers, people thought you were a boffin and a genius automatically, regardless of how banal it was, whatever you were doing, because computers meant, this guy is smart. I mean, today, of course, it seems completely banal, the whole question. But so I started working there. And when I initially produced pure tape music that had no interaction with live players, and I got so fascinated by the idea that I could have complete control of the musical material and leave it recorded on tape forever, that nobody would be able to tamper with. And then I think at that time, probably amongst the people doing tape music, there was this feeling that we are doing away with the performer. Great. So this went on for a while. I did 3 pieces, pure tape pieces. And I won a prize with 2 of them, so I was even further encouraged. But after a while, something was missing, of course, the performer. And there's nothing more exciting than for a human being than another human being, as we're finding out now that we're in lockdown. So writing music that did not involve somebody on stage doing something, again, this word magical, that you look at it and you hear it and you think that's amazing. That's an experience that you remove that from the musical experience, and however wonderful the music is, there's some, for me at least, there was something missing. And at the same time, what happened was that I got commissions to do mixed pieces. I had never mixed the 2 media, and that was not new, of course, but it wasn't as as established as it is today, as run of the mill. So, and I also thought this is quite a challenge, because in what way do these 2 media intersect? And there were far too many pieces that I thought didn't work, precisely because no one had worked out the relationship between the 2 media. And to me, they were not talking to each other. So I, at the same time, around that period, a little bit later, I got invited to work at IRCAM, which was the new institute started by Pierre Boulez in Paris. And they had computers and fantastic facilities. And the ideology that prevailed at that time, which interested me, and it was an ideology that I fitted into, and together with other composers, we started pioneering, was the ideology or the idea of in music, creating interpolations between the acoustic instruments and the electroacoustic domain. Later on, the term morphing was introduced, and that is used in video as well. So the idea that you have a sound produced by a voice or an acoustic instrument that you can see and hear, on stage, and that sound from within transforms into something else. That seemed something impossible that never existed before in the history of sound. And but now you're seeing it and hearing it on stage. So having the live player produce a sound that then, by means of computer transformation, you actually in a credible way managed to get it to in front of the listener, transform from within, was the holy grail at that time. So there was a period of time that interpolation, or then, as I said, sound morphing, became the holy grail of at least those of us who were working in France. And that informed a lot of my vocal music at that time. I was writing more vocal music than anything else, because nothing is more magical than the voice turning into something else. So I had pieces that start with something else turning into a voice, or a voice turning into something else, and the voice is on stage. So that requires very precise synchronization between the electroacoustic material, or the computer-generated material, and the person on stage via a click track. So that was one of the issues that I was very concerned with. And then all of my music started to have a dimension where the intersection between the two media had to do more with extending the sound world of the acoustic instruments rather than creating a separate independent sound world. I'm not saying that that's not a valid approach to composition. I'm just saying it was not my approach. You can have the two sound worlds juxtapose each other. It's not what I do and what I've done. So I've been more interested in creating an extended meta sound world. So if what you have on stage is a voice, then the electroacoustic should be a voice-like sound world. And if it's a violin-like sound world, or if it's a cello, whatever. And of course, then years later, when I started working with percussion instruments, some of that was carried over into the percussion world. I mean, which is a little bit trickier, because percussion instruments have an amplitude envelope that makes it much harder to do that sort of thing, because it decays exponentially. So you don't have often enough time to do interpolations or sound morphings or whatever. But
it sounds like you use, for example, in percussion, a lot of the times one basic effect, which is the vibraphone, say, will become the resonance of a marimba. You will even write this and say, okay, I've designed this in such a way, if there's no electronics involved, I would imagine in electronics, what you do is, follow that idea up in different ways. But basically using our sounds to morph them afterwards. And obviously if one has no sustain, you take it over immediately. And if it does, maybe you take advantage of that, I take it?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a case of my experience in the electroacoustic world, then informing my orchestration in that sense. Mm-hmm. So in pieces like, I think that my central interest in intersecting the two sound worlds and the way in which I do it has not really changed for the last 40 years. I'm sorry if that sounds a bit boring, but it hasn't. I mean, the technology has changed and the possibilities have changed, but I still want the electroacoustic element in a piece to be an extension, even if of the acoustic instruments on stage, even if the extension goes into something that finally is quite different, even remote. But I want to feel that the departing point is the sound world of the acoustic instrument or the voice. So I think that is true in tumblers as it is in stress and flow, or in madera, viento y metal. And, I can't focus too much on my percussion works because I only have 3 percussion works with electronics, whereas I have plenty more with voice or whatever. So, but I think that you can probably hear a lot of what I'm saying in both madera, viento y metal and stress and flow. And that's why it's so important that the sync becomes very critical in these pieces. And the balance between the electroacoustics and the actual instruments, because if the balance is not, as I was saying yesterday, is not right, if it's too quiet or too loud. If it's too quiet, you don't feel a progression from the acoustic sound on stage into this transformation over time. And if it's too loud, then it overpowers the instruments and gives away the game. So, and then of course, syncing is much more critical than in other pieces. Some people have done away with click tracks because they write the kind of music that synchronization is not so critical. But if you are going to try to conjure what I would call the magic of pretending that a sound that you triggered on stage changes or resonates in an impossible way, like in my marimba and electronics piece, for example, it's a wooden sound, but now resonates like a metallic sound. It has to be, the two attacks have to be absolutely in sync and perfect.
No, this is funny because I know how you guys feel about this. But Alejandro, in my opinion, in the percussion world, a lot of times we spend time learning how to practice playing in solid time. Say there's a metronomic time, but actually playing a piece of music with a click track, it's slightly different than that. Even though it may seem that technically, if you just play everything in time, everything is going to be okay. There is a lot more of a complexity when it comes to the layering, the phrasing, the voicing. You go at this. There's so many layers. It becomes difficult because now you're not only worried about the time, yet you have to play in time. And I feel honestly that one of the things I remember personally having to really learn how to do is how to play musically in time, so that we can be as accurate as possible in what you're talking about, where you're really playing with the metronome, the click track, but in such a way that literally that is almost as if it's not the priority to the listener, even though it sounds perfectly in tune. No one knows that you're really playing to a click, yet you are. I don't know how you guys feel about this. What's your experiences in this? Mari, have you done some of this stuff? How did you guys deal with this with stress and flow too?
I haven't played this part, the stress and flow, but I remember, Alejandro, before you started writing this piece, we saw each other a couple of years ago, and you weren't sure if you are comfortable with letting people use electronics and click track, because we prefer not to use click tracks so that we can hear each other's better. But I'm really glad that you did, because this piece is really awesome. Yeah, Matt, what was your experience like?
That's good. I can touch on that a little bit. And then I do want to get to a question that came into us that's sort of along the same lines. So, because this does deal with the second part of the question that came to us. But I can say that one thing for me is that when I'm actually performing something like stress and flow, the first thing is I turn the click as far down as I possibly can. Because maybe when I first start rehearsing it, I want to be very aware of where that is, and I reference that a lot. Really, the only point of having the click is to play or to be able to sync with the electronics. And I think that sometimes people forget that they think the click is there to help them through the piece, but it's not. It's just simply for alignment of you with the electronics, and it actually doesn't have anything to do with you playing with everyone else. So you have to be incredibly flexible while this beeping is going on in your ear, which is difficult. I think it's like for anyone who's played Bach, and you learn the type of rubato that's inside Bach, but then what you do is you have to be able to turn your metronome on and be able to play freely within the time while this pulse is still going on. I think it's a similar feeling when you're doing these electroacoustic works with some sort of click track. So the question that came into us is actually from a former student of mine. His name is Jade Hales, and I taught him long ago. And Jade is actually a member of, or a student at Southern Oregon University who has the Left Edge percussion group, and they are one of the consortium members on Stress and Flow. So I think that this is going to be a great question for someone who this is very applicable to. So the question is, can Alejandro and everyone discuss stress and flow? So first, I think just in general, kind of what is the piece? What is it about? Maybe Alejandro can do a brief summary of the 3 videos that he made. And then the question goes on, how was the rehearsal process, and what should an ensemble focus most on when rehearsing this? And the final part of the question is, what kind of preparation should go into this piece before the first rehearsal? So sort of those 3 parts. And maybe we can start with Alejandro just talking, again, kind of like you did in those amazing 3 videos about the separate movements.
Well, adding much more than what I said in those videos will eat into our time here in a big way, I have to say. But the titles actually of the subtitles of each movement tell you quite a bit about what the music is about. Of course, the music is about tunes, rhythms, harmonies, like any other piece of music. But it's also about this relationship where we're discussing with this other sound world, or with electroacoustic sound world. And in the case of the first movement, as I was saying, as I think explained in the videos, I can't remember exactly what I say in those videos, but you have the contrast between the darkness and the heaviness and the lightness, and that is stressed and extended by the electroacoustic sound world. So I think that when you're playing, for example, the opening of the piece, you have to keep that in mind. Sometimes I feel that some people can play that opening too loud. I mean, the marimba part too loud. It's the electroacoustic part is still quiet, so you have to give it, perhaps match that sound and allow this darkness to creep in gradually, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think that it's easy as a performer, I think, to think just of the crotchets and quavers of a piece, or in this case, of all the time signature changes and all of that. But you also have to focus on the relationship with electroacoustics, because you're coming to the end of a phrase and you are triggering something, and you have to be aware of the sound you are triggering. Of course, you're not triggering, it's the electroacoustic doing it, but the illusion is that you are triggering it, and you should feel that.
Yeah, I feel like for any piece with electronics like this, whether it's a solo with electronics or like Stress and Flow, it's a quartet with electronics, it always helps me to think of the solo as actually a duo, and the quartet is actually a quintet, and getting to know the electronic part as well as, certainly, your own part and the other players' parts, and finding a way to participate with the electronics in some way. So you almost trick yourself and you feel like you did create that sound or cause it to happen, or it affects you in some way. And I think when you have the click track, it's really tempting to be like, well, if I play with the click, then that's good enough.
Yeah. Incidentally, I wanted to say something about that today, because you all guys have computers and you can open sound files and you can see the click track. There is no reason why you should not bring the level down. I mean, open it in whatever sequence that you have. And when there is a bar or a sequence of bars where you don't need the click track, or you only need the downbeat, but you don't need any of the other beats, just, bring down the fader for just that period, save it like that, so that click track, at least when you're practicing on your own, you don't have to hear it. You only hear it when you need it. I mean, it's there throughout, but you don't have to have it loud throughout. You can just change it. You can even conceivably, that's a little bit tricky, but conceivably in concert, feed each one of you a different click track, one that is being edited for your own purposes. You don't want to hear all of the beats in this bar, somebody else may want to. So that's also possible. I mean, it's of course more things that could go wrong the more separate tracks we have, but I think that's something to I've done that in concerts for people, and that is useful. Coming back to the original question, what I wanted to say is that how do you prepare a piece? I think all pieces, in my view, should be prepared the same way, which is understand what the piece is about, phrase by phrase, and then globally. So don't think you're just a performer in an ensemble. Think, let's imagine if I were the conductor here. What is this piece about? What is happening here? What is foreground? What is background? If you understand what the priorities are, because you understand, you've analyzed the musical discourse, that will tell you how to prepare the piece. And I think that's the same whether you're playing Mozart or whether you're playing anything else. I mean, perhaps the procedures and the processes in a piece like Stress and Flow will be very different from, obviously, 18th century or 19th century music, but it's still the structure. At least that's how I compose music. I compose music thinking of the overall structure, because in our tradition, the art Western music tradition, what we have invented that no other tradition has invented is large-scale form. That's what we have. We think very much of harmonies that are advanced or not advanced, or rhythms that are more complex, but actually in popular music has a lot of things that are even better than what we have. For example, phrasing in popular music is usually much more complex than in classical music. You can take classical Arabic singing, for example, or the music of Mongolia, what Aretha Franklin is doing in some of those 1970s recordings, and the amount of articulation per bar is absolutely astonishing, you know. But what no popular music, no music has that our tradition does have is large-scale form, a narrative that begins with introducing an element, an idea, a tune, a rhythm, whatever. And over time, there is a voyage of transformation that goes somewhere else. Popular music, whether it is jazz, rock, hip hop, flamenco, tango, whatever, is basically recursive. It doesn't have large scale form. You present an idea and it stays more or less the same throughout. And I'm not saying this in any way to belittle popular music. I played professionally popular music for many years before I came to Europe. So, and I love it. I'm simply saying that, and that is the strength of popular music. But our art form is about form and the developmental aspect of form, whether it's a process like in, you know, systems music, Steve Reich, for example, or it's the sonata form of, you know, Beethoven or whatever. It's about developing an idea, taking it somewhere else. So as a player, you have to understand what is the idea that is being developed and where is that idea being taken. So, that's more important than worrying about whether you're playing this right or wrong or the time signature or whatever. That's how you should start, in my opinion. That's how you should start, and, you know, studying a piece, a composition of any kind, not just mine, but any other composition.
So considering basically then what you're saying then is that we need to, as performers, especially with stress and flow, understand how when you also carve the electronics, you carve them in time. How the electronics develop as a form, and how can you basically try to emulate that when we're also playing? Because clearly, you know, electronics are not changeable. So when you have devised them, when you've written them, you have created certain arc with them. And so would you imagine that one really good thing for every one of us who is learning pieces of electronics, say for stress and flow or any other of your music, do you think it's relevant for us to try one time to listen just to the electronic part with the score, and just literally listen to that and try to understand how you thought of this? Obviously, watching the electronics, which you not only write in the score, you write all the dynamics as if it's another part, but just try to understand how is this part supposed to inform our own decisions to learn our own part, and then of course the piece as a whole.
Yes, absolutely. I do that when I finish a piece. I play from the beginning to the end, just the electronics on their own, and I imagine listening to the electronics on their own as a player. I do that myself, assuming that you will do that anyway, simply because, well, you get the sound files and you play them, and in the beginning you may not go to the instrument. You just have the score and you think, what is this? How does it work?
Yeah.
How do I deal with this material? So I'm assuming that that's something that you would do almost without intentionally trying to do it. It will just probably happen to you. But there's no harm in doing intentionally. No, I mean, that's, I think, is a good idea.
Sure. How did you guys practice when you were guys learning the piece? You know, I was going to say something here that may be useful information to anyone who is interested to play pieces with electronics where they need a click track. You know, a lot of times right now what we do is we put in your, you know, whether it's a regular headphone or like really high quality studio headphone that really isolates your ear. I don't know if this helps you, but one thing I've discovered, and tell me guys what you think, but actually I'm trying to use worse and worse, or like lower quality actual earbuds, because they actually do not isolate my ears so much, and so I can really use that ear not only to listen to the electronics but also to hear from the outside world, so that where the earbud is not really fully closing my one of my ears completely. And in that sense, I don't know if you guys have checked this out, but there's these bone conducting headphones now that are being sold, which actually are placed to the sides of your ears, not in your ears. Now, they are not going to give you really high quality music playback, and I think they're going to have some leak of sound, but if you want, you can try using these because they would allow both of your ears to stay open, and at the same time you can hear actual audio because they're connected to your ear bones.
That sounds very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Yeah? Oh yeah, Mario, you tried these.
Yeah, I used it for Seaborn actually, and I got to hear everybody. You know, we had 6 people playing at the same time, so it was really useful. But I was going to mention also, this is very basic, but when you're working on any piece, I think we can create, before you get together and start putting marimbas, vibraphone, chimes, and xylophone together, you can get together as a group, just 4 of you, if you're working at the Stress and Flow at a coffee shop, and start writing adjectives and create letter numbers so that you can understand the form as a group, and your rehearsal process would be more with purpose, I think.
I'd like to, before we talk more about the sort of the practical side of how to rehearse this type of music and some of that, I'd like to latch on to something actually that Alejandro said a second ago when he was talking about popular music, because this is one thing that interests me about your music immensely, and I know this is a big question to ask you to answer, but I've always wondered this and how you deal with this side of your music. So it seems to me that your music strikes a unique and very successful balance between complexity and accessibility. Is this dichotomy a conscious part of your compositional process, and does that reflect a certain ideology that you have about music?
Yeah, there is this, for me, a huge question that will require the next 5 hours to answer, but I'll try to do it in 5 minutes. No, the thing is, this is tied up to my perception. When I came to Europe, very quickly, I realized that there was a problem that was a very serious problem. And the problem was that audiences were getting smaller and smaller, but also older and older. Not just for contemporary music. Actually, contemporary music had relatively younger audience. It's just classical music, art, Western European music. The audiences were getting older and older. And eventually did some research on the matter. And I realized that since 1920, the average age in America of somebody going to an orchestral concert was in the late 20s. And now is in the 60s. So there is a basically demographic time bomb there, which is eventually when old people die, if young people don't take their place, then there will be no audience left. And so the realization of that made me wonder about the responsibility of the composer in that context, because I've heard all kinds of justifications for the difficulty audiences have in relating to contemporary music, especially in Europe, and especially when I was here in the 70s and 80s, which was, the prevailing doctrines were very, very hard. And if you step outside the prevailing aesthetic, you were not played, you were crucified very quickly. If you were too consonant, that's wrong. And if you had a lot of pulse in your music, was wrong. And so there were a lot of all of these taboos prevailing. And I asked myself the following question: what is it that legitimizes our art form? Why shouldn't our art form, well, if it disappears, so why shouldn't it disappear? I mean, everything disappears ultimately. All art forms from the past have gone at some point. The Japanese had gagaku music, which was fantastic. It's all gone. I mean, so it's eventually the planet will go. Everything at some point must finish, must be done with. Why should our art form be any different? And that brings me to what I said before, because we are the only music that has large-scale form. And I love music that doesn't have large-scale form, but I wouldn't like to live in a world that doesn't have large-scale form, that doesn't have, for example, novels, just short stories, to compare that to literature. So novels are complex and long because the narrative is complex and long. And And the same is true of our musical form. So if that is what matters, the form of music, then surely the surface of the music should not be what matters. So if I'm going to develop a large-scale form piece where very complex things are going to happen, like, for example, let's take the last movement of Water. Very complex polyphonic relationships are happening there that have to do with the perception of decoupling of lines that are decoupled because you hear multiple simultaneous pulses going on, to the extent that sometimes some of those pulses seem to be running at a different speed, at a different tempo. All of these complexities are hard for a listener to take on board. And if you don't take that on board, then the work becomes thin and less meaningful. So if I'm going to start with something that is already complex, nobody will understand the subject to which all of these processes are happening. It's like in a novel, if you don't understand who is the central character, then you don't know that what is happening in the novel is happening to this character. You begin to wonder, who is it that is going through this war? For example, in War and Peace, oh no, I understand, is this character, that character, I can understand how they're related. So if I start with something, a melodic or rhythmic pulse that people are familiar with in this culture now, because it's part of the sound world of our time. It's part of the spirit of our time. The Germans have a wonderful word, Zeitgeist, that if it's part of the spirit, if you start, for example, with a groove that everybody can relate to because in popular music you're familiar with, then you can take that somewhere else and create a lot of complexity around that initial material. And then you know that at least at the beginning, people will recognize the groove because they're familiar with grooves, and they will be able to follow you to a very considerable extent, perhaps all the way to the end. And if at some point in the piece they feel that this has gone somewhere else, where is the groove? They may think that actually is interesting. There was a groove a minute ago, and without me noticing, it's turned into this texture, and now it comes back to the groove. Oh, again, this word magic, for me, that can conjure some sort of magic. Whereas if you start with something that is so complex that no one can identify, then some perhaps very interesting process is taking place, but I can't, I'm not able to follow the process because I don't know to which musical idea this process is applied to. And that is the reason why I try to use either rhythms or melodies or both from the popular domain, which in fact is what most composers of the past did when they created very complex ideas. I mean, I always mention Bach's Chaconne for solo violin. That's an incredibly complex polyphonic piece, but it starts with a very simple dance. I mean, it couldn't be more simple, the Chaconne. Now, for us, it means nothing today, but at that time, everybody knew what the Chaconne was. So if Bach can create such incredible complexity, starting from something so simple, maybe he's teaching me something that I can take from that experience. And what is teaching me is that the final complexity of the piece is not defined by how simple the initial material is, but by the complexity of the journey. And if any further proof was necessary, let's think of the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Those minor thirds, I mean, you know, how banal and simple they are. They are nothing in themselves, but he writes the most incredible developmental sonata form out of it. That is, it's a model of how you create developmental music. My Russian teacher that I mentioned earlier on always told me mockingly, if I came to a class and I said, "Mo maestro, I haven't started composing yet the piece you told me to compose," because I couldn't think of an initial theme or initial tune or something. He would say, "Oh, you can't think of a tune? I can tell you a supermarket where they sell tunes." I mean, he would always take the piece of me. And so I'm sure he was doing it with other students too, not just with me. But it's the idea of, don't tell me you couldn't start composing just because you didn't have the initial idea. Who cares about the initial idea? Just The only thing that matters is what you're going to do with it. So if you want to start with something completely banal, so be it. Or if you start with something glorious, well, also great. But that should not be the criteria. And so this time and age, if we're not going to disappear, we're going to remain as part of the social fabric of our time, culturally speaking, then we have to make an effort to start with something that is at least initially appealing, especially to young people. Otherwise, we come back to the other subject I mentioned earlier, which is the demographic problem.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing to hear how much you care about your listeners. Like I know composers deal with this in different ways, but it seems like you're acutely aware of kind of who this music is going out to or who you want it to reach, which is this is a really refreshing thing to hear for me. And another question that this brings to mind is, do you
can you bear with me a second? Because as you can see, my image is getting darker and darker.
No
because
problem.
it's getting dark in London. I need to switch the lights on. Just
no problem. We'll wait. Yeah.
While this is happening, I just wanted to make a quick comment. Just because we were talking about groove, one of the things that I really appreciate about Alejandro, I was talking about what I appreciate about your music, Alejandro, is that a lot of times you actually would even write that it's really important that the player would focus on the groove, and I say that because especially if you think about classical music, groove is not something that generally gets mentioned when you talk about classical music, even though I feel that, as you mentioned, there is some classical music that definitely could groove. There is definitely lines of music that could groove. That's not always, those terms are not very often, mentioned in the same sentence, if you will. And I really appreciate the fact that you actually really speak to us about this in your pieces. You actually really indicate the importance of that, the importance of the feel of something that is going to oscillate, and it needs to create a momentum. Even, for example, if that is what you talk about as the simple element that basically would engage the listener. And, in the collective, one of the things I know for a fact is when we begin working on for example, on stress and flow, or in projects in generally, that's one of the most important things for us, is to find the sound of the piece of music and to find the feel of the piece of music we're about to play, to understand, literally, to try to really get into both in the heart and in the mind of the creator, and to just try to justify, by performing the best we can, justify what they wanted to say and do. But especially when it comes to groove, I think that stress and flow in any of your music has this incredible vibrancy. And at the same time, I think that personally is one of the ways in which it's extremely accessible to people, because people gravitate to groove. Groove is in the culture.
Well, it's the question of a groove in music that is developmental, that is large scale form, is actually an interesting question that I always found puzzling, because if you think about it, a groove and the idea of developing a groove, they are anathema. It's like almost an oxymoron. The whole point of a groove is that it repeats and repeats always the same. Mm-hmm. So you're going to say, I'm going to take a groove as a departing idea for a piece that is going to develop. Then how is that going to work? There are contradictions. So the first time that I consciously thought about that and thought if I could find a way of developing a groove throughout a composition was in a piece that you, Svet, has played, which is Arabesco Infinito. Mm. And that is a study almost on the question of how you can make a groove develop. And it's not easy because at least in that piece, it was absolutely conscious, because if you start repeating a groove and you change something of that repetition, the chances are it's going to stop grooving. So you're going to have to find a way of adding a note or subtracting a note or changing one of the pitches or something, which is part of the process in that piece, where by adding something or taking something away, you feel that it's still the same groove, but slightly modified. And if you do that step by step, you're gradually taking the groove harmonically and rhythmically somewhere else, but the listener feels that it's still the same groove, but it's changing. So it is possible to groove while you change, but it is something that you have to do in a delicate manner. Being very careful of which notes. Sometimes you have a transformation that is very interesting, but it cancels the grooving. So you say, well, no, this I'm going to abandon, because the idea here is to see if I can do the impossible, make a groove, transform, and keep on grooving. So that piece taught me a lot, because I used it as a testing ground for the notion that a groove could be part of a transformational process rather than just mere cyclical repetition.
Yeah. Well, I think we can learn a lot also from drum set players. There's some really amazing groove masters in the world. I've got to say, I joke about it. I think like many percussionists are closet drum set players. We all love to do this, and I think that honestly, the joke for me has always been that, in fact, if someone wants to be a really great percussionist, maybe they could do something else that can contribute to that. And if somebody wants to be a really amazing drummer, I feel like basically groove is one of the most essential elements, and percussionists actually being able to play drums can really become so much better at playing groove, because one of the first things that we have to learn when we play drums, I think, are basic grooves, not basic beats, basic grooves. And I think that in your music, I think that has been super helpful to me personally, where I would play. John, you play some drums. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I was actually thinking it reminds me of what Alejandro was saying earlier about the subtlety that exists in pop music, that in some ways the pop art forms actually have way more like articulation and versatility, just because since so much of it is aural, you're actually picking up on this remarkably fine-tuned like sense of hearing that we have to like pick up on, this gradient of dynamics and stuff like that. And I feel like to notate that into written music would take ages, to really communicate all that subtlety, but to just do it kind of intuitively, I think is something that you do train a lot on drum set, or even just learning other pop art forms. And then,
Johnny, you remember when we went to Ghana? So 6 of us from Collective, we went to Ghana as a part of Yale Concert Band tour. And remember when you guys played drummings in a small courtyard for people who are not, professionally musicians, but they got it. They got all the transitions and they went nuts. They went screaming, clapping, and yeah. What was it like to play?
Oh yeah, I mean, exactly like you said, it's like and actually this kind of pertains to a question that we just got about audiences around the world. And that was pretty remarkable to see this visceral communication still happening halfway around the world, and people getting it every bit as well, if not more so, as people who are more, steeped in that tradition or something. But someone asked,
Johnny, if I could ask just to add to this, because I think that there was a question before that I think we can try to answer also in this setting. One of the things in a collective that I feel we have to do, because especially for many of us, we're not based in the same city. And so rehearsals, when we prepare, whether it's Stress and Flow or it's Seaboard or it's Theophanidis or it's any piece, we have to really show up extremely prepared. And it's funny, I mean, in some way, the preparation comes from knowing the score literally like a madman. You have to know it like a conductor would, literally, just understanding the depth of the score, the dimensions of the score. You're understanding this literally from within. But one of the things that I find, especially with Stress and Flow, which is extremely unique about this, is actually that the feel of the piece. Alejandro, even when you have different grooves, they have different depths to them. And you cannot, there's certain limitations within a groove. We cannot say go too far back on the beat because there is an electronics playing with us. We cannot necessarily color a groove too much. So understanding what are the limitations, what are the parameters of every groove is actually super important. And I honestly think that this is literally where I think to myself, of trying to basically use drummers to help me understand what they do, because a lot of the times the groove, when I learn, for example, grooves, I feel like it really is about the way that I move that really affects everything. Movement affects the feel. How one moves affects the feel. And so it's interesting, Alejandro, because I spend a lot of time personally, for example, trying to figure out how to do something so that it fits with what you want, as a writer. And it's a really fun process, honestly. I really highly recommend it. For example, if you can compare the grooves of different drummers and watch how they move, you will see how that can help contribute to different types of feels, And then I think that's one of the things that, it's been super helpful to me in your music, to just try to understand what to do based on what you need, and understanding actually literally how do I move very particularly to get what you want,
And I wonder if that's something you have in mind, Alejandro, of physical movements. It seems like in a lot of your pieces, there's something physical or something having to do with motion, even in the titles of things or in the type of music or your descriptions inside it. Could you talk if that's been inspiration, or if you think in terms of motion in any way?
Yes, I do think about motion. But actually not from the point of view of the player. I think about from motion from the point of view of the listener. Actually, I think,
really,
how is the listener going to feel here? How is this rhythm or this pulse going to affect the listener? And then there is a second layer, a second voice that is doing something that goes against it. What is the listener going to do? Try to split his or her mind to follow both of them, or follow one and then jump to the other one and back? I'm always thinking about that. I mean, how is the? I imagine a listener tapping with his or her foot. I mean, at this point, how would you tap? And sometimes, there is no answer to that, because you either tap with this voice or with that voice. But that's actually precisely what I want to do with my music. I want to start with something that you can tap to easily, but then there is a dichotomy. I either tap with this voice or that voice. If the listener experiences that physically, it's because the listener is indeed experiencing the decoupling of the voices. Is experiencing that there are two ways of tapping, in other words, two pulses, and perhaps even two tempi suggested. And so, yes, it is a physical thing. And if you experience it physically, this kind of polyphony and these kind of polyrhythms then become much more interesting, because it does, as a listener, I'm saying again. Now, how is the... I am aware, of course, that from the point of view of the performer, how they approach this physically matters. I'm aware of that because performers tell me that. And I remember once Svet, when he was preparing a recording of Can Variations, so that there was a passage where I said, everybody had a problem in that passage. And I said, okay, let's change. I mean, if everybody has a problem, I may as well rewrite it. And he said, and then he came back to me and said, no. And I sent him a rewritten bit of that passage. He said, no, but the original one is better. He told me off. He was right. The original was better. But I was prepared to let go of the original. And he said, I figured out how to play it. It's just that I was not standing properly. It was the physical position that prevented him from getting it right. So I thought, okay. But of course, I can't figure that one out. That's got to be the player, because I don't play the marimba.
But it's funny because you have always asked an amazing question. I remember when you first wrote Can, and I remember Robert van Sice gave me the music and said, hey, you should really learn this piece. And I remember sending you some audio clips and you saying, what do you think about this variation? And I think it was the variation after the speed changes, right after basically this middle slow section of the piece. And I played you, I sent you a snippet of it, and you said, what do you think about this measure? And I said, I think I just need to practice more. It's not ready. It's not smooth enough. And you said, no. I just want to know, does it really work well for the instrument? And I always kept that in mind. Honestly, anytime I work with composers, I'm just really grateful when people have that in mind, when something is just homogenically written in such a way that it just fits the instrument naturally, even if it's difficult. There's a difference between music being really hard and music being really just written in a way that doesn't fit the design of the instrument we're playing.
Yeah, whether it's contrived or it's or it's difficult, but it feels right. And that's, I mean, I don't have any hesitation changing music if a player tells me that this is not, it's not even a question of whether it's idiomatic, but if it's physically contrived, then I'm prepared to change it. And I know that some composers are more reluctant to do that, but I think that I was talking with about this very subject with Mike Barrett, and I said to him, look, there are two things that a composer might be asked by a performer who is not happy with what you've written or has something to say about it. He may ask you to change something that is structural, that has to do with the syntax and the discourse of the music. Or they may ask you to change something that is simply got to do with a particular disposition of notes, but it's not going to change the music. If you rearrange the order of the notes, it would still be the same music. It's your job as a composer. You should have the skills to change it without changing the music. So if somebody asks you to change the meaning, which is the form, the structure of the music, I mean, they may still be right. Perhaps there's something wrong with the structure, but you are much more justified in being reluctant to defer to a performer. But if the performer is saying this doesn't really work, I mean, it's in your interest, really. I mean, it's not a question of being modest, it's a question of being selfish. It's when I asked you, tell me if this works, I'm just thinking of my own self-interest. It's not that I'm that open. It's just that I realize if I can rewrite this so that it works better, it's better for me, better for the piece.
This reminds me of one thing that you and Bob were talking about yesterday when discussing the marimba concerto. He talks about this event where you took a bunch of the notes out, and he learned all of these really hard notes, and then you came back and said, no, that's not working. And the phrase was, you can play it, but you can't groove it. And so I'm curious, like, what you think about that, and when you're willing to do that sort of thing, because there's obviously a preference when you have people play your music to have it sound in a convincing way, not the feat of just getting through it, but that it's performed in a way that is convincing.
Yeah, well, I have to do that less and less because I've learned throughout the years. I mean, you know, I'm not that young anymore. So no, I mean, after years and years of paying attention to what players say, I've learned, especially with instruments that are, I mean, initially to me, unusual instruments. The marimba was an unusual instrument. I mean, 30 years ago, the marimba, especially 5-octave marimba, was an unusual instrument. In London, there was only one for rental. So that's the whole of London. So to learn to write for an instrument like that involves a certain amount of experience. Now I think I get 90 or 95% of everything I write to work the first time, or perhaps even more than that. I mean, I think I've written 1 or 2 pieces that I didn't have to change a single note. Whereas I think in Madera, Viento y Metal, I didn't have to change anything. Whereas when I was writing the marimba concerto, I was less experienced writing for the marimba. And also, I was less inclined to compromise. I was younger. You know, when you're young, you're less inclined to compromise, which is probably a good thing. But there is a time for everything in life, and when you have more experience, then you find it easier to compromise and easier to. And you're less impressed by complexity for its own sake. So, and as I was saying before, I'm less focusing on the complexity of the local structure or the local syntax on a particular bar-to-bar complexity. I'm more interested in the complexity of the overall form. So if something needs to be changed in a bar so that it flows better, it's not a problem, because that is very unlikely to interfere with the form of the overall form of the piece, the overall syntax of the piece.
So Alejandro, there is a question for you here.
Yeah.
What keeps you artistically fueled and inspired? And related to that, what do you like to listen to or to read?
Ooh.
Ooh.
That's what I like to listen to and to read. Well, it's first of well, what keeps me inspired? Well, musically speaking, a vast range of musics. I've always been interested in music of other cultures. I grew up in Argentina listening to classical music, tango, folk music of Argentina, which is it's very different from tango. I played Brazilian music myself at the guitar, but and of course I discovered Piazzolla when I was very young, so that that was very inspiring at that time, and for many years. And then I discovered this is to give you an idea throughout time how various kinds of music have inspired me. Gamelan music, I discovered Bulgarian choirs. I mean, you're from Bulgaria, so you know what I'm talking about. That was their singing in parallel seconds was like, and so beautifully tuned. I always loved that. Mongolian music, especially vocal Mongolian music, that was orchestral music from Japan, Gagaku. They had orchestras in the Nara period. In the year 700, they had orchestras which were large orchestras up to 200 players. So all of these other musics have always been interesting, and as well, of course, as my personal heroes in our own tradition, which I could briefly say, Bach, Debussy, some of Stravinsky, and well, many others. I mean, that would be a ridiculously short list. Reading, I also read a lot, but at some point I started reading scientific books, which I had never done. Especially when I came across a Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking back in the 80s, and that launched me into a cosmological adventure. I mean, I became very interested in cosmology, in physics, and that kind of scientific literature, which then expanded into biology and other things as well. So I do read a lot of that, and right now I'm reading the works of Bakunin, which is an anarchist, Russian anarchist from the 19th century, this very moment.
Just to tell you, it's really fun pun that you read Brief History of Time, considering that you like time in your pieces and rhythm is so important to you.
But I think he's talking about time in a different scale.
Oh, I do know that. Definitely. I think he's a bit more global about this. No, but I'm certain that all of this connects into your music, and literally your music unites universes of a lot of this as well in it. One thing I know we're going to move on to another question. I wanted to say something that I think came out here in a conversation that maybe it's worth verbalizing. Alejandro, it seems to me that what you're saying is that anytime when we perform your music, one of the things, which I think is globally, it's universally true for every music, but especially in your case, because you consider it as a composer from the design standpoint of every piece, there is, if the piece is a duet, it's always a trio because you are thinking about the listener. If the piece is a solo, it's a duet. And in other words, you want the performer to think about the audience, say very early on, just being aware. Not that you're trying to please the audience, you're just wanting to make sure that you understand what their experience is like based on what you're playing.
Yeah, well, my Russian composer teacher back in Argentina used to say to me with this heavy Russian accent, I still remember it, used to say, you finish a piece, now put it in the fridge and go away, freeze it, okay? And come out, and then a month later take it out and then read through it. Well, to me that it suggests something. It suggests that you should go away, forget that you compose it, and now look at the piece as a listener. Can I follow this piece? Who wrote this? I mean, does it make sense? That sort of thing. I mean, it's not easy. That's why he said, go away, put it in the fridge and come back. And sometimes I write something and I come back sometime later and I think that's not really working very well. As a listener, I'm not so happy with it. so that, yeah, that the listener is me when I come back and listen to it sometime later.
Awesome. Yeah, it reminds me of, I'm just so curious about the creative process in general and kind of what goes into making something out of nothing, or recombining the things you have in your head. And do you think there are ideas in your head right now that have been there for years and years and years, and they just haven't quite found the piece to latch onto yet? Or do you feel like the ideas are really born from what you're working on in that moment?
Well, I mean, it varies. All of this, I can't give you it's not that I have one answer that, you know, that fits all the occasions and all the moments in time. Sometimes I have an idea which is not particularly interesting, but it's there and it's been there for a long time. It varies from piece to piece. Sometimes the initial idea is, for example, a simple melodic or rhythmic cell, like in can variations, and then the conceptual form for the piece comes much later. Other times is the other way around. I mean, in the case of can variations, is a good example of an idea that is in a way sort of trivial, because the tune of can variations is a secondary tune in a track by Ali Fatah Khan, and you know what is fantastic is his singing, nothing to do with that line. The line is played by some accordion-like instrument, and it's not even a line that I thought to be particularly interesting. I was always listening to his singing because I always thought that he was an amazing singer. But of course, what he was singing was too complex to use as original material. It's too melismatic, too rich in itself. This line was there, and you know, I kept hearing it. Sometimes when I go into my garden, I do some gardening, I have some bit of music that is obsessively coming back to me in a repetitive way. And most of the time is not very good music, actually. Sometimes it's something that I've just heard, whatever, on the radio, whatever, and I can't get rid of it. And I think, why is this in my head taking precious space? But sometimes it's there, and you think like this counter melody, which is the tune, the opening, you know, the tune that is subjected to the 8 variations, the variation, and it's there, and it continues to be there for a long period of time, and then it becomes the subject matter of a piece. But as I said earlier on, ultimately what matters is what you do with the idea. So it doesn't matter if you have an idea that is not very interesting, lingering in your mind, and then to get rid of it, perhaps you just use it. Because if you do something interesting, the piece is going to work. And if you have a great idea, but you don't do something interesting, then the piece is going to start wonderfully, and then will fade away and not capture the imagination of people. So,
yeah.
So sometimes I start a piece by thinking about processes, absolutely, without any doubt. For example, the Homage to Nancaro is a piece that started with a process in mind, because I was thinking of the music of Nancaro, and I was thinking of multiple simultaneous times and what it means to write music where the various layers or the various strands of music, or the various polyphonic lines, appear or indeed are going at different tempi. In the case of the music of Colonel Nancaro, they are going at a different tempi. But in the case of Ligeti, who was also influenced by Nancaro, he actually used polyrhythms to create the illusion that they're going at different tempi, but actually they still have a common unit binding them together, which is the grid of the piece. So I was thinking about all of these things, how Ligeti used the ideas of Nancaro and what he had done magnificently well and what he had not done at all that I could do. And what I could do different from him, even if he had done it. For example, in his Autumn in Warsaw piano etude, which is, Nancaro at his, is the conversion of Nancaro's ideas into polyrhythmic world, in trying to do it so that a player can play it rather than a pianola, which is what Nancaro wrote for. In doing that, he decided that he was going to conceal the unit which binds these 2 lines or 3 lines together. So if, for example, you are counting in 16th notes and you play a note every 7 once, then the melody is spaced, the length, the separation between every note is 7 16th notes, and another line is 5. So you have 7 against 5. So that's strange. So it's going to feel like they are not related, the 2 lines. One is going in 7 and in units of 7, the other one in units of 5. But of course, both players in my piece, or just the one player in the case of Ligeti, are counting 16 notes or groups of 16 notes. Otherwise, they would get out of sync with each other. Now, Ligeti, of course, wants to hide the counting, the unit, the grid, to emphasize the fact that the 2 lines appear to be unrelated. But I thought, wouldn't it be fun to first give the listener the grid as a groove and then take it away and present the decoupled voices? And the players are still desperately trying to count in these units, but as you well know, Svet is remembering from his performance of the piece. But the listener at that point is going to hear these decoupled voices. But in the beginning, there was a groove. So rather than having a piece that is the lines are completely decoupled from each other by way of these complex polyrhythms from the beginning to the end of the piece, you come in and out of the groove. So the groove works as a pivotal point in the piece, and that's a dramatic device. So the piece opens with this very simple groove, and then the lines get decoupled, and then whenever that particular phrase or section finishes, it finishes back in the grid that is revealed once again as a groove. So in that case, you can see that piece, or that movement at least, started with an idea. You're thinking, okay, Nancaro proposes that, Ligeti transforms it into this way, and let's see what he did, and let's see what one can do that is different, not because it's going to be better than Ligeti, but simply because it's something he didn't do that maybe is interesting to do. To answer your initial question, it depends. Sometimes you can start with something that is simply in your head and you can't get rid of it, and it's just the tune. And sometimes you start with a concept, and from that concept, then you have to find what tune would be appropriate for this idea. The tunes in Homage to Nancaro, they are ascending or descending modal scales. By and large, emphasize and make it more viable to project these ideas of multitemporality.
I really like that the ideas are less about being musical lines and more about being like processes or manipulations of these lines that can help kind of create that large form. I think that's really inspiring.
You brought up this common motive in your music, which is the idea of multiple simultaneous times. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on it, because I can tell you my interpretation of how that works in your music is that it's kind of the great contextualizer. So that music sounds in different ways depending on what that other time is. And so I think to like Steve Reich's music, of whether you hear da 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 or da 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 da. And that I feel like in your music, those multiple simultaneous times, at least for me, function in that same way of recontextualizing a melodic line. I'm curious, one, if that's correct at all, or if like how you think about that.
No, yes, absolutely. But I mean, all polyphony works like that. If you think about a fugue by Bach, you can listen to a fugue, 4-part fugue, and it could be like almost a texture wallpaper, because you're hearing all 4 parts going on at the same time. And that can be interesting. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Or you can focus on one of the melodies, and then there is a canon, and you focus on one, and then you jump to the other one and jump to the third one and the counter subject. And at some point you may find that you relax into it and you think or you feel that you are following all 4 at the same time somehow, at least for a short period of time. And then your mind jumps again into one and focuses on one, perhaps because the player is bringing it out. I mean, the great master of that was Glenn Gould, he would bring out a line, and when he's playing a fugue, he's telling you which line you should focus on. Other times, which is wonderful, he was a genius doing that. Other times, your mind may just jump from one line to the other, and that's when you listen to a polyphonic structure like that, focusing on one line, that gives you as you said, a context, a point of reference from which you're listening to the piece. When you're listening from the perspective of another line, it's a different point of reference. And when you're listening to the whole thing globally, that's still another point of reference. And it's not written that any of those points of references it should be the most important one or the one that prevails. On the contrary, I would say that gives the piece greater depth, because you can listen to it in one way, and then after a while you get tired of listening to it in this way and you listen to it in another way, or maybe it's not even a question of getting tired, but it just happens to you. And that happens to me when I listen to Bach or any other music. So I think that especially, as I said, polyphonic music, what you focus on gives you a definite perspective and a context. And yes, I mean, it's not that I'm intentionally trying to do that, but I know that will be the case when I'm writing music with multiple simultaneous times.
Alejandro, we have a few questions came in, and I wonder maybe, I know one of them is just a yes or a no, maybe that's a quick one. The name Todos los Ríos al Río, from water, was that inspired from Cortázar's book?
Absolutely, yes, of course.
Awesome.
I think I mentioned that in the score, if I'm not mistaken.
Awesome.
But if I didn't, I should.
It's a double check. Here we go. And there's a question from Hannah who says, when you first approached writing for percussion, what did you utilize for reference points, pieces or composers, regarding idiomatic writing, use of timbres, etc.? And was your, forgive me, I just want to double check, your first percussion involved piece, was that tumblers?
Tumblers, yes.
Tumblers. Okay, so violin and marimba and electronics, for those who are watching, great piece, check it out, fantastic piece.
Well, but for starters, I have to say that, when I was writing tumblers, I wasn't thinking I'm writing a percussion piece. I was just writing a piece for violin, marimba, and electronics. I mean, why should it be a percussion piece? It could also be a violin piece. Why should I prioritize? And in fact, in the beginning, the piece got played a lot in the beginning, but it was not because percussion players were programming it. It was programmed by festivals, institutions. One person that pushed that piece a lot was George Benjamin, who had it played in the Opera of Paris, in California, in some festival. It was later on that percussionists start pushing it, and then they became the primary force behind the piece. But I never think, I mean, to go back to try to answer that question, I never think I'm writing percussion music. Just as I never think when I write vocal music, which I've written a lot, I never think I'm writing vocal music. Of course, from the technical point of view, you're writing vocal music. There are some things you can do with a voice and some things you can't do with a voice, of course. And the more experienced you become, the more you use what belongs comfortably in vocal production, or the kind of phrasing, articulation, or whatever that percussion that belongs in the percussion world. So it may seem from the outside that you're thinking I'm writing a percussion piece, but I always think I'm writing music. I don't make a division. I don't think, oh, my percussion music. Sometimes you have to talk like that, but I don't think like that. So when I first writing percussion music, I didn't think I was writing percussion music. So I wasn't drawing from any other percussion music because I wasn't thinking that way. I might as well just drawn inspiration from violin music or for electronics, because the piece had electronics, violin, and so on. And then when I wrote the marimba concerto, I wasn't thinking, oh, I should listen to other marimba concertos. I was more thinking I should understand what a concerto is. and how a concerto can function, not just a marimba concerto, any concerto. So I've never been influenced by the percussion writing of other composers. I've been influenced by their approach to composition, but not by specifically whether they're writing for this or that medium, which is not to say, again, that you cannot learn technique from other composers. If you're writing for the voice, you may learn something about the technique, but that's not how I think. Which is not, I'm not saying that it's wrong to think that way. It's just I don't think that way.
No, but I love this in a sense. You're talking about the fact that you're thinking about writing a piece of music first. And I think that really sets the value of something at a very high level. You know, the priority is the art. And it's interesting to start thinking from that perspective, because then what you're doing is, I think in a way, I don't know, Mari, I know you guys with Gab, for example, have done a lot of this music. And I feel like that's why, in a way, I really love your music, is because the priority lays with the art. And you challenge us, but at the end of the day, there's this really rewarding experience artistically, you know, after all challenges. Mari, what is your experience with this? You guys have played a Book of Grooves. You've done a bunch of Alejandro's music. What is your experience like with this?
Yeah, so Book of Grooves is the first piece that Garrett and I worked on together, because Bob we were playing around in a room, playing conversations, unison, because we're working on the piece at that time, and at Norfolk. Unison. I'm working conversation. Oh, me too. So we play conversation unison together, and Bob was in the room. And
it's not hard enough to play it on your own, but you have to.
Apparently not.
And Bob said, I saw you guys play conversation together. Why don't you play Book of Grooves? I think it's gonna be a good project. And we got addicted to the music, and because of that piece, we wanted to form a duo, and so that we can play Book of Grooves entire life, basically. So yeah, we definitely enjoy your music.
One further thing to answer Hannah's question. When I was writing tumblers, and I had to write for a marimba, and I had never written for a marimba. After writing for the piece, somebody came to me and said, you must have written for the marimba before, because this feels like, you have experience with the instrument or something like that. I said, no, I had no experience. Maybe I should have looked at how other people have written for the marimba. Maybe Hannah is right. That should have been the approach. But I did something else. And I think I might have mentioned this to you, Svet. I can't remember if I did. But anyway, I picked up 4 pencils and grabbed them as sticks and tried to play on my keyboard in the studio with the pencils, because I thought, okay, this keyboard, of course, is nothing like a marimba keyboard, but it gives me an idea of the angle of the sticks and how the wrist alters the angle of the intervals that you're playing. So since I don't have a marimba, I can have some idea whether something is going to work or not physically, because I'm now grabbing these 4 pencils.
You just want to say to yourself that, okay, this is not so hard. You guys should be able to figure it out.
So that was a sort of unorthodox approach, but it seemed to me that it was practical in some way, because it helped me visualize a problem that is difficult to see. And I've coached some composers writing for marimba occasionally, and one thing that I realize is that nobody pays attention, because of course it's counterintuitive that the angle of the wrist is fundamental in whether something is playable or not, and where you're coming from. If you've written something in the keyboard, seems perfectly normal in a piano, but if you have to change the angle of your wrist and bring the sticks very close to play a second, that interval, which is a piece of cake in the piano, it's hard. And then also the fact that you have to fit those 2 long sticks so that they play on the right part of the bar, that's not going to be so easy. And so that you can see when you're holding pencils. So I don't know if that complements.
That's great. We don't have to do so many of like
something like that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Great. Well, you've been so generous to give us your time and have this conversation with us. So we feel really lucky to have the chance just to know you and to have your music, and we all love it so much and are very grateful for everything that you've done for our group and done for our art form. I think we just have one more question, if that's okay. I'll let Svet ask it.
Of course.
Oh, I'm going to ask it. Well, I think one of the things, first of all, that we wanted to try to do is say thank you to all the people from around the world who are watching this and who are with us and contributing and supporting both the collective and Alejandro and percussion in general in these times. I'm glad we're all together in this, and we'll continue to do these live streams and stay involved. Please join us again. One of the things that we wanted to try to do is try to communicate with Alejandro and try to give a way for people to get to know his inner world and understand better who he is as a creator, as a person even, and to understand then better how to approach his music. But one question that we all had that we're really curious about for you and hopefully for everybody who's listening is, what is, purely musically speaking, what is the one musical commission that you have not been asked yet to write, but you really are dreaming to write?
Okay. Involving, of course, percussion, or plenty of percussion. Yes.
Selfishly,
yes.
Well,
I
actually,
would
Alejandro, what if you speak for both? What if you say if it's percussion or if not? But we would love to know what you have to say. Okay. No limits.
I would like to write a piece for a significantly larger number of percussionists playing together. I would like to write a piece that has 7 or maybe 8 percussionists, a piano, and an electric bass.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm selecting those instruments has to do with the sounds that I always, when I'm writing for marimbas and vibraphones and xylophones and skin percussion or whatever, there is always some. There is a range that is always. I don't know if that is the best way of expressing it. There are some deficiencies that I struggle with. For example, there is a range, the bottom range of the piano. No percussion instrument covers that range with pitch, of course. I mean, obviously without pitch. So I want to go down, and I want to go down with a sound that has a strong fundamental. The marimba, for starters, doesn't have a strong fundamental when you go down. Beautiful color, but not a strong fundamental. And then it only goes so far. And if you go, and if you want something that has clarity at the top, the piano has it as well. And if you, of course, you have a xylophone or a glockenspiel that also sound in that register, but the sound is too thin and it's not quite the same as the piano. So that's something. And if you want to sustain a sound in the middle, the piano. So that's why I had the piano in water, because I knew that it will combine. I mean, for me, it combines beautifully with all the it's a percussion instrument ultimately. Let's not forget. And so I want to have a piano, or maybe even 2, but certainly 1. And the reason why I want to have an electric bass is because I want sustain fundamental low notes to be heard clearly. With a double bass, you will need to amplify it. With an electric bass, they'll have to amplify it anyway, so there wouldn't be an issue. And you can sustain sounds that neither the piano can do some of it, but better than the piano and better than any other tune sounds that would blend very well and provide a harmonic support to all these other things that are happening on top. So, but I also would like to have enough percussion players, because I often find myself making players run around on stage just to make it to this or that instrument. And you're composing a passage, and so many times it's happened, certainly happened in water, that I had to rewrite the passage because I didn't have a free player. And I thought, okay, this sounds great, but actually, and stress and flow the same. This does not, I can see that there's no time for this guy to, to get from this instrument to that instrument. And, this, so you start with these bizarre calculations. What if the xylophone player dropped it here and then went to the vibraphone, but then this other guy went to the xylophone, and you think, no, what I need is an extra player. That's the way to do it, rather than have people, moving around frantically on stage. So 2 marimbas, I want. 2 vibraphones, I want. Xylophone, I want. And I would like to have free players to play skin drums, rather than think, oh, no, I can't have this conga here because he's playing the marimba. No, I want some guy that is going to play the conga, period, end of story. And he's there. And if he's got to play nothing for 10 bars, well, that's fine. But I can sit down and write as if I were writing for an orchestra, rather than have to think of the logistics of who's going to play what and where on stage. Therefore, 7 or 8 players will give me that. And then, as I said, the piano and the double bass, because I need them for harmonic and reasons, and for the timbre and the projection of the sound and the range. So that's one piece I like to write before I die.
Duly noted. Duly noted. Everyone who is out there, I think that sounds like maybe we can talk about another consortium yet to come, which will put us together one more time.
Absolutely. I want to hear that piece. I'll take the conga part.
Okay.
I'll take conga too.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thanks again so much, Alejandro. Really, this has been just invaluable information for the entire hour and a half. And I wish we could do more sessions. Maybe we will, who knows? But yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone watching. This has just been a treat for all of us. Stay tuned. Next week, we'll have another episode of this with Garth Neustadter on Seaborn. But yes, this has been just a real blessing today, and happy Easter all around. And until next time.
And thank you to Doug Perry for producing.
Right.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, guys. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you, and to all the listeners, and to all of you and all the listeners. Stay safe.
You too.
You too.
And thank you for being such a wonderful power and force in what we do. We love you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.